What is up, homebrewed Christianity listeners? This is Tripp, and today on the podcast, you get the return of the Dr. Monica A. Coleman. That's right, she is a professor at Claremont School of Theology, and she is here to talk some process, some spiritual liberation, and let you know about the Summer Institute at the Center for Process Studies. It is going to be happening June 5th through 8th of 2017. She'll tell you more about it, but it's 3 different classes. She's teaching one of them. And yeah. So before we jump in to this amazing episode, I just wanted to give you a heads up. That's right. If you live around the Denver area or Oklahoma City, then you need to get yourself to theologybeercamp.com so that you can hang out with me and Peter Rollins. We're coming to do Theology Beer Camp this summer in August in your neck of the woods. So you need to go there. You need to check it out. And then you need to realize that, like what other camp is it that an adult theology nerd could go to and enjoy? And also, I got a couple questions from people that, are not locals, but I've told you Southwest has those summer fairs. Those are both Southwest cities, so you can fly in. And if you're coming, there's a Facebook group for everybody that's going, and there are groups of people, our camp counselors, you could say, for each event that are in there ready to give you answers about, where can I stay, all that kind of stuff. All right? theologybeercamp.com. And also, I'm going to be at Wild Goose. That's right, in North Carolina this July. Wild Goose, it is a festival for spirituality, arts, music. It is like the only time you can go camping with a couple thousand progressive Christians. Anyway, I love going there. I'm going to be there. I'm going to be doing the podcast and some other stuff. If you're going, let me know, because Nathan and I are working so that the deacons that are coming, the ones that want to get together so we can camp near each other, enjoy craft beverages together in the evening, get nerdy and junk, camp near each other. I know our Brew Theology friends from Denver are going to be there, so I know there's going to be some serious nerdy camping areas. So if you're wanting to be a part of that, then let us know. And last but not least, let me give you a heads up. So last summer, Walter Brueggemann and I taught a Bible class here at the Hatchery. This is the school where I work. And we're about to do a giveaway thing where the Hatchery, not me, where you enter to win a giant stack of Brueggemann books and the class. Like, we've edited all the lectures and stuff, and this is like Walter Brueggemann's Hebrew Bible lecture. So just be on the lookout, and you'll find out about it because I just interviewed him for Homebrewed. That's right. Walter Brueggemann will be on the podcast, and then this whole giveaway thing starts. It's going to be sweet. All right? Just letting you know. But without further ado, here we go. Monica A. Coleman. She's right here talking about this Process Summer Institute, which I know you're interested in. You can do it online. You can do it in person, June 5th, 8th. Here she is. Boom. Hello, homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and today it's your lucky day. It is your lucky day because you're going to get to hear from Monica A. Coleman. She is back on the podcast, and I am pretty excited about it. Not just because I get to talk to her, but because I get to tell you about a really cool opportunity this summer that's happening in Claremont. It is the Summer Process Institute, and the beginning of June, the 5th through the 8th. And if you are sitting there thinking about going process and want to test the waters, this is the time to do it. So, before we jump in and start talking about all sorts of fun stuff, why don't you give us the lure for the summer?
Well, I think what's really great about this is that it's really hard to kind of get a chance to learn something new. A lot of times you're always kind of stuck in what you're doing. You're still time commitments. Doesn't mean you don't want to learn something new, but time to read a book, the time to read all the books you want to read, the time to kind of say, hey, I've been curious about this. How do I learn this? I think it's really hard to kind of find that kind of time and have the opportunity, whether you've had a PhD for 10 years or you're active in ministry or you've finished your MDiv a couple of years ago and you're like, hey, what are people doing now? And so what I like about the Summer Process Institute is a chance to do that. If you've never heard of process, if you've heard something about process, if you have a general sense of what process is about, but you want to know more, all those reasons, it's a great class to take. And you can do it in 4 days, which is also really convenient. So that's the lure to me, and that we've got some, bright and great thinkers in the field who are doing this with us. And you can do it online. If you're near Claremont, you can drive to campus and hang out with us in person. And we do it in real time so that you can be there almost in the classroom and ask questions, get your questions answered. And there's nothing you have to read. You just have to show up with your ideas.
Mm-hmm. So that's
a lure to me, no homework.
Oh, yeah.
Well, if you're taking it for credit, there's homework. But most people take it, if you're taking it for your own personal joy, no homework, nothing to read, no prep, just come.
Well, and so if you're interested, you can, there'll be links to everything on the post for this episode. But the Process and Faith website is processandfaith.org. It's super catchy. So, you'll remember it. So don't wreck while you're driving.
Exactly.
So the class that you're teaching is called Exploring Process Thought, Spiritual Terrorism and Spiritual Liberation. So when did you just say to yourself, you know what I want to teach a class on? Where was the origin of this class?
Well, the name of it actually came from when I was at Christianity 21 a couple years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. And I was kind of talking about, I said you can talk about whatever you think is important to know about Christianity for the 21st century. And for me, one thing that draws me to process, why I love process thought, is that I find it liberating. I find it to be a way in which I can kind of keep my brain and keep my faith, that no one asks me to check the things I know about the world, about science, about my experiences at the door, but I can really put them together. And for me, that's liberating. And I experience that as a stark contrast to some of the teachings I grew up with, some of the teachings that are in traditional churches, even of my own faith, and that are terrorizing. Mm-hmm. Now, today, terrorism usually invokes all the gloomy music you hear on TV shows and guys with guns and, accents that aren't American, just kind of the media propaganda of what terrorism means and high alerts at airports. But really, terrorism just means things that cause fear. And, a lot of the things that I've been raised with and many other people have been raised with in our religions and our faith really create more fear than they do freedom. And so I want to talk about process in the context of what are some of the things we've been taught that really just make us more fearful and make us feel smaller and make us feel further from God. Mm-hmm. And how does process free us from that?
So when, growing up for you, were there particular ideas or kind of theological assumptions from your faith community that when you started reflecting in theological education and connected with process that kind of first initiated this transition to a more liberating way of seeing theology?
Well, there are a couple teachings. I think some of the ones that, if I told you now, then you wouldn't take the class, right? No.
Wow.
A couple of, one was everything happens for a reason, or God let X or Y happen for a reason. And that was a particularly disturbing one for me, because that means God either makes the bad things happen or watches the bad things happen and goes, oh, well, Mm-hmm. And that's always been a particularly tough one for me, particularly if the bad thing's happening to you or to me. Then it's even harder. So I'm supposed to worship a God that's okay with bad stuff happening to me, or that lets bad things happen to me for any reason. That's always been a pretty tough one for me. And that really kind of drove me to find another response.
Was there, how would you describe the way, underneath that desire for God to be in control, I think is the human desire for finding or at least putting meaning right in the middle of our suffering and our pain. That religion, among other things, is one of the tools humans use to find meaning and purpose in things that. And so when we say God was in control, in some sense you go, yeah, well, God might not be the nicest person, but at least there's a purpose, right, to the suffering or the pain. And I've found it striking how many people resist leaving omnipotence behind not because they think, oh yeah, great. God's at least as nice as Jesus. This is good news. It makes sense for Christian theology. But the other side of it is then how can we be secure? How do we find meaning? Why? Like the question of why just takes a different tone.
Yeah, I agree. And I remember it was hard for me at first to let go of the idea of God being in control when I first encountered process. I'm like, so if I pray to this God and God's not in control, why am I praying to someone who can't make things happen? That's not cool. And I chucked the book across the room, right? I was not about that because that was what I had been raised with as well. And it just was like, okay, this is part of what it means to be Christian. I think what came to really feel stronger to me, and particularly the more I read the Hebrew Bible, was this way of always seeing God as being in relationship with humanity, right? We talk about the covenantal relationship between God and the Hebrew people. And even Jesus was always in relationship with the disciples and didn't really make them do stuff, right? It was like, hey, I invite you to do this. It'd be really cool if you did that. Hey, I'm in a relationship with you. And even when you make me angry and when you don't do what I like you to do, you're kind of stuck with me in terms of the Hebrew Bible as well. And I was like, well, that's pretty powerful and that's pretty moving. And that's not really controlling the way that I have been thinking of God as being in control. And so for me, it actually was a more biblical faith in a lot of ways to be process oriented and to think about that I have real agency. So when I'm praying or acting or doing things, it's real. I'm not being puppeted, right, by somebody up there, so to say. And that must mean that God is not in control the way I thought that God was in control, which was actually more what my experience was saying anyway.
So how do you make sense of kind of that very engaged, participatory depiction of God in Hebrew scriptures, and how do you connect that to kind of process philosophy? Because I think a lot of people get uneasy with kind of anthropological language about God, and the process critique of kind of classical theism in a lot of the ways Feuerbach and friends were like, yeah, that makes good sense. But we also end up arguing for a very engaged understanding of the divine, and that it is, how do you respond then to kind of that anthropological critique that this that God ends up being like the superhuman shaped?
Well, I'm kind of okay with that. I think I'm very comfortable with anthropological images of God. Because they're images, right? They're metaphors. There's a way that we try to make concrete something that we know is bigger than what it is, right? And so I'm comfortable with thinking of God personified, as being in the hand of God, in the hollow of God's hand, right? It's a very common expression, right? Of God having hands and arms and feet, and, not in the what does God look like per se, but in the God holding me, God walking with me. These kind of metaphors I'm very comfortable with. I believe that God is in everything, right? And so if God's in everything, then God's in everything, including people and trees and amoebas and kelp and right, everything. So I'm really okay with the anthropomorphic sense of God in those kind of images, because I know that they're, ways in which I relate to God, not the only ways. There are other ways to relate to God. There are plenty of people who are in process who prefer less anthropomorphic ways of relating to God. They think of God as creativity. They think of God as love, God as divine intelligence, and all of those work. I just happen to like anthropological images, but I think there are plenty of ways to be process-oriented and think in terms of concepts.
Well, you kind of described earlier that that there can be unforeseen negative consequences to our images around God, and I wonder if there are images in particular for you that that need dethroned, right? Like if you hear one sermon from a minister, sometimes you're like, oh, that's good. But if you heard 50 of them, you're like, I'm pretty sure you're only got about 3% of scripture in your sermons and 2% of life. And it's the kind of narrowing of your images that makes them end up being problematic rather than the image itself. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I studied under Sally McFague, right?
Hmm.
So that's what I know of. I began with metaphorical theology and with models of God, and with the idea that the bigger challenge is that our metaphors have become models, have become entrenched, and that we've narrowed them to like four as compared to expanding them. And they've become, most of the models that we reify are male, paternalistic, you know, culturally entrenched models, right? As our images. And so the more images we have, the better it works. But I think it depends on your context, right?
Hmm.
So I have a friend who was raised on a farm. So the Bible makes a lot of sense to him because he knows a lot about seeds, right? If you're raised in the city, someone has to kind of keep explaining to you how seeds grow, or else that doesn't really make sense, right? Because Jesus is talking to people using parables and the metaphors that made sense to them. So why would we not use metaphors that are relevant for where we are and who we are and what our experiences are?
So when you're thinking of the process philosophy and the way it has connected with multiple religious traditions, like what is how do you understand from a process perspective the reality of God in multiple religious traditions?
Well, I think it's more that for many ways, many people who are trained in theology, you're working within one religious tradition, right? You read the Christian tradition, but it might be another tradition. And you're taught to think about, well, what do these different parts of my faith mean? What does God mean? What does salvation mean? What does church mean? What does community mean? What does it mean to sin or do something wrong? And process really comes at the whole thing differently.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than thinking about what are these different tenets of my hands doing this, you can't see tenets of my faith doing. It's more, how do we think God and the world relate to each other? And that includes everything, including my faith. So we're thinking about, well, we believe there's a God, and there are people who do process without God.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not one of those people, but there are people who do it. It can be done, right? When you think about who is this God, right? And if you're not a God person, we call the concept creativity, but the idea that there is a force in the world that keeps things going,
Mm-hmm.
right? Whether you get there through Big Bang or through Buddhism, right? That there is something in the world that is either undergirds us or is somehow greater than us. And there's the world. And for all of us, we're thinking about, how do the multiverses work? How do the universes work? And that includes our faith. And so whichever faith tradition you come from, you can think of it, so to say, in a process way, through a process lens.
Mm-hmm. Well, how would you kind of describe the relationship then of kind of an individual spirituality and in religion, or like, what is a process way of kind of accounting for people saying like, I'm spiritual but not religious?
Well, I think when people say I'm spiritual but not religious, it's a rebellion against the worst parts of religion, most of which I agree with, mm-hmm. right? The bad parts of what people say are organized religions, the ways in which it makes people feel terrorized rather than free. And so I think many people find the more freedom in the term spirituality because it allows them to disassociate from the worst parts, the most legalistic aspects, the parts that draw lines on who is in and who is out, that exist within most traditions, mm-hmm. most religious traditions. So I understand that. Ideally, right, religion and spirituality go together. And religion is about how we organize ourselves and how we organize our beliefs. And spirituality is about what we do every day, how we live those things out. It includes our ethics, our morals, our practices. And so what does a process spirituality look like? It's just like, what does life look like? Mm-hmm. We have a blog on the homepage of processandfaith.org where we ask people to just write about their everyday spirituality. And what that looks like from a process perspective. So for me, it's because I believe God is in everything. My spiritual practices are really diverse. It doesn't have to be the official spiritual practices like meditation and fasting and Bible reading. So those are cool. But it means that I can really find God in music. I can find God in cycling. I can find God in stopping with my child to look at a rock, right? Because I know that God is there.
Mm-hmm. Well, how does kind of your understanding as of this everyday spirituality impact the way you see yourself as an educator and as a leader in the church?
question. I think probably that I teach that our lives are probably much more spiritual than we think they are. And that there's so many things that we do that if we do them with that kind of attentiveness to the presence of God being there are part of our spiritual practices. One thing that was really revolutionary for me, for example, is when my daughter was blessed in our religious tradition, the minister says, raising her is now your spiritual practice. I mean, now she was a baby, so it's like keeping her alive is now your spiritual practice because she was only a couple months old. But it really kind of is, and it was. And so for me, that was a really processed perspective. It didn't have to mean that we had an hour every day to meditate because, right, if you've got a newborn, you don't.
Oh, yeah.
Or if you do, you sleep when you close your eyes, right? Or that I was going to be reading the Bible and writing sermons, which I kind of did until she got older and could move, right? But it meant that literally just the way in which I was nurturing her, God was in that practice.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess how does that impact me as a teacher, as an educator, is that's what I tell people. That's what I share with people, that, holy isn't as holy as we think it is. And that we really can find God everywhere, and that we can then embody the vision of God in our everyday lives too.
Mm-hmm. Well, so what was it like teaching? You talked about teaching in class this semester, and when you're tag team teaching, and then you're picking a topic and you're teaching across religious traditions, and you have people in the class across it. I think that type of experience is something, if you're at Claremont, you think, oh yeah, well that happens here. But for a lot of people in different parts of theological education, having a Christian and a Muslim teaching a class together isn't two friends hanging out and they lucked out to get the draw of teaching
basically
together.
Yeah.
So maybe you could describe kind of what that was like, especially this semester. I mean, going into that class, and it wasn't timed given how much kind of activism and kind of the need for communities of faith to organize and things that wasn't expected when the class lined up.
Right. I mean, as you know, in education, you're planning your classes a year or two out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we designed it as, for some way, for fun, right? So we could teach together, so you could teach with your friends. But also, I have a strong background in African American history and culture. My colleague, Najeeba Saeed, has a strong background in interreligious studies, interreligious education, and Islam. And these are also, in the traditions, we're both kind of lived around these traditions a lot, although neither one of us would locate ourselves in the traditions. Mm-hmm. And so it was actually a ton of fun, right? Because we could bring in friends, we could bring in contemporary work, we could teach both classics in the field, and kind of teach off hip hop and the internet and what's going on now. We could Skype people in. And what made it, I think, really fun to teach was that we really we were very intentional about how we were going to work against dominant narratives. Mm-hmm. And so the very dominant narratives on when did, in this case, African-American Islams begin, which actually began with enslaved Africans who were Muslim. Mm-hmm. So the first Muslims in the country were probably enslaved Africans, for example, or working against media images of what does a Muslim look like and when does this begin and what do African-American Muslims believe, and that there are various traditions within African-American Islams, or what does it mean to be Orthodox or to not be Orthodox, to be hybrid or syncretic, and really pushing against those categories to show how religion and culture and politics and image always intersect. And those are lessons that are true across traditions, whether you're looking at African-American Islam, you could say the same thing about Christianity, mm-hmm. about Buddhism, right? So we wanted to also kind of look at these larger issues that are not specific really just to what we were studying. But oh my gosh, it's so much fun, right? Mm-hmm. Because I get to learn while I'm teaching. I get to learn more about my colleagues' experiences, what she knows, who are contemporary people in the field. We looked at both activists, people who are scholars, as well as people who are religious leaders from different organizations. We took site visits where people really opened up their communities for us to learn from them. And that's a real joy because ideally you're always mm-hmm. learning while you're teaching.
Yeah. Do you think that the or maybe put it this way. You spend quite a bit of time traveling across the country and, visit different parts of the church, different educational institutions, and all sorts of different settings. And I'm interested if what kind of observations you've made given kind of the cultural, religious, political climate today, as you went out sharing about your book and telling your story and starting to engage people. At the same time, you have kind of macro political things going on that raise the anxiety level and the tendency for lots of communities when they get anxious is to retreat into kind of the trusted old narratives, which have a lot of these ideas in it that can end up being terrorizing for people. So, if what kind of observations have you made kind of, as you've traveled around and experienced and seen and engaged different people in different parts of the church?
Well, I found that honestly and oddly, that the political situation makes it easier to have conversations right now because so many more things are at the fore. Mm-hmm. So it's easier to talk about race. It's easier to talk about culture. It's easier to talk about anxiety. It's easier to talk about depression and self-care, all of which I love to talk about. Mm-hmm. And what does our faith have to do with that? And how do our churches interact with that? And how do we be activists, both in our families and in the wider world? Because these things are on the forefront of everyone's mind. So in many ways, it was not that I am thrilled about the kind of polarization we have in our politics right now, but because of that, people are more able and willing to talk about the issues that arise for them as they wrestle with it. So in that case, it made it so much easier to talk about, our health, our care, our spiritual practices, our activism, because people are asking about that more and thinking about it more.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that, I grew up in the South and remains thoroughly irritating is the continued data about white evangelical support of Donald Trump. And, he's more popular than the Bushes were. And I guess the difficulty isn't that, I don't know, that I have lots of family members that have voted for people I didn't like before. It's the way in which he kind of mocks what you could point at previously as at least the semi-positive redemptive things in it, right? Like the expectation for integrity or whatever, that kind of stuff. And I'm wonder from like not being a white dude from the South with all that baggage connected to it and kind of always constantly processing it for me, how or maybe what's a helpful way or a positive way to begin owning and addressing kind of the ugliness that just sits there in the American church?
That's a big question. Well, I mean, I think I know a lot of evangelicals who feel very strongly about dealing with politics and racism and Christianity, and so they always redeem evangelicalism for me, right? And say that all evangelicals are coming from the same place politically, and that's always very helpful. And they're out there writing and blogging and going, creating conferences and doing really, really great work. So I think that's a big part of it. I think those of us who study Christianity outside of Western Christendom have long understood that there are various Christianities, right? And any New Testament scholar will tell you the same thing. There always have been, right? I mean, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, 4 different Christianities, right? That it's always been Christian histories, right? And Christian communities and Christian traditions. We've never all been Christian in the same way. Just all the battles over the creeds show you that, all the way up to, the ways in which Armenians are Christians, how African Americans are Christians, right? How Southern evangelicals are Christians, right? And so I think that feels like newer information for some people than it does for other people. And I think it feels more startling for some people than it does for other people. But for those of us who've long known that we can own the same faith and understand it very differently, this is just yet another instance of it rather than a brand new occurrence. And so I think it's kind of every church's responsibility to say, really, what is the core of the gospel?
Mm-hmm.
What is that? What does it mean? And what does it mean for us? And I think there will always be those who say to be Christian means to believe a certain statement about Jesus. And I think there will be others who will say to be Christian means to embody certain aspects of what we know about Jesus' ministry.
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably where the biggest divide is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, I guess for me, one of the things that has continually, it remains dumbfounding, even though I don't know why it should be, is the power that very narrow account of salvation at the heart of American evangelicalism has to cover over it creates a vapor where then large portions of Scripture, like almost every time salvation's used in the Hebrew Bible, it's about transforming material reality or political situations or something, not escaping eternal conscious torment. And I wonder if there's a sense when you start to think about like ideas of spiritual terrorism type thing that maybe there's something about that very individualistic, escapist account of salvation that just perverts one's faith, that they continue. Like, I know plenty of people try to rehabilitate it there and all kinds of stuff, but it, I haven't lost sleep that I might end up in hell in a long time. So, but I wonder if what you think is there something about that telling of the gospel in that narrow way that sets up this case, or is it, I don't know, just connected?
I think so. Although, I find most spiritually terrorizing ideas aren't biblical. Most of the things that, create a lot of fear and that make our faith and our world smaller are not that biblically grounded. Mm-hmm. But most people also don't read the Bible. And so as we know, or we read the lectionary parts of the Bible, or we read the stories that you get like in Vacation Bible School, but don't sit down and read it. Not, of course, the homebrewed audience, but some other people out there, some of them tend not to read the Bible. And so, and we get, like everything else, might get most of their information, including their faith, on Sunday morning or in sound bites or from the media, right? And so whoever has the loudest voice wins. And so I think of just a smaller version, yes, as you said, a narrower version of Christianity is what's presented. And because people aren't reading the Hebrew Bible, they're not getting some of the other richness that's there. They're not reading all of the Gospels themselves, right? And getting some of the richness that's there. They're like, yeah, well, I know that this comes from the Bible. This idea does, right? I mean, and there are a million ideas out there, right, that I find terrorizing, most of which, have a little bit of footing in the Bible, but proportionately are not the way in which God talks about relationships, the way in which we know about salvation, and the way in which we know about how to deal with poverty, right? Those kinds of things. But the people, there's a louder voice, right? There's just a louder voice in all around us that has a narrower idea.
So when you use the word liberation in the title, it kind of spell that out for us. What do you mean by liberation?
Well, it means to be more free, right? So to me, freedom it's about an individual freedom. It's about a collective freedom. For me, that's both like, do we feel more free in terms of how we live our lives? Do we feel more free in our ideals? And also, are we fighting for freedom? For me, there's always a justice component, both because of the connotation of liberation theology, but to me, even with process, there's always a call to change the world, not just to change our individual lives. And so for me, that's the part of liberation. But it's both and, right? It's like I have to be individually more free, feel less hemmed in, less oppressed as a person in my own beliefs, not to be scared of my God, but to be happy to be in relationship with my God and partnership with my God. And then about wanting everyone else to have the same kinds of liberties and freedoms and opportunities and choices and quality of life that I want for myself.
So
the whole love thy neighbor thing.
Yeah, it's very, very popular line. More difficult to do.
Totally hard, but good ideal.
So how would you describe God's relationship to each moment, and then what God brings to the next? Because I think one of the things about process thought is the way in which God is participating in and receiving the world and then giving possibilities to the world, that the concept of liberation then isn't one that you vision where, oh, well, we need liberating, so maybe God can finally come in and fix things and, set things right and just, bam, intervene. But like liberation is part of the breathing in and breathing out of God in the world. And I find that to be one of the most beautiful things in process thought. And I always like hearing people talk about it.
Well, yes, exactly. I always say it's radically incarnational. Mm-hmm. So I grew up going to Catholic school, and Catholic school talks about the incarnation, right? Which happens in Jesus, in the Immaculate Conception. And the implication is that God is in the world in Jesus, right? Which I think is very cool, all that John 1 stuff, right? And dwelt among us and put on flesh. I mean, it's beautiful, right? And so I like that. And the thing is that it implies once. And what process says is, no, God is in everything all the time, in our cells, in our very fiber of who we are, right? The term closer than our very breath, that God is deeply inside of us, deeply with us, and calling us in that process. And God is receiving all of who we are, all of what happens in the world, and that becomes part of who God is. And God takes all of who God is and tries to find what's very best of it, right? Tries to find the most ideal aspects of it and calls us over and over again in every moment, in every microsecond, onto something new, onto the most creative way we can be in the world. Now, usually this is not very exciting. It happens at a cellular level, like keep breathing. Yes, breathing.
We support breathing.
Right? Cells keep reproducing, right? But when it happens in our souls and in our minds and in our consciousness, it's pretty great.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think kind of spiritually, one of the important parts of it to me is realizing that kind of the call God gives to us moment to moment comes from God having fully participated and experienced the world. It's not a call from the abstract. Well, hey, Tripp, be nice, or you should do the loving thing, and that kind of thing. It comes from having fully shared in the experience moment to moment. And that makes, I don't know, I think the hope or call of liberation a much more realist one, and one that where there is no place you can go to escape the love of God that calls in each moment. Like you can be in the worst situation or the best situation, a challenging one or joy or whatever. God is experiencing it, sharing it with you, and then calling forth something that is more beautiful than we could imagine and anticipate. Like that reciprocal relationship God has with the world is one where the liberation is it's like justice is an everyday practice, not like some kind of utopian thing coming out in the future. And liberation is an activity God's always engaged in, and we're called to cooperate with.
Right, and that becomes the meaning of suffering. We talked about at the very beginning, right? Is that, where is God in the suffering? Well, God's right there. God's in us. God is experiencing what we are experiencing, and mourning with us and crying with us. And when we're rejoicing with us. And in that moment, still seeing more than we can imagine is possible for what might be creative and transformative for us.
Mm-hmm. So when you're thinking of kind of you're like the next time you get to go on sabbatical and you get to
am thinking of it.
And you get to pick a stack of books because you want to go read a bunch of books and you want to write something, like where's your theological imagination wanting to go wandering?
Man, I'm going to read all the fiction I've missed, all the nonfiction I've missed. Yeah, probably. Yes, actually. I might read I want to read my friends' books, the books my colleagues have written. Although I might get to read those before I get on sabbatical. That's the hope. That's where I go. I actually go back to fiction. I go back to novels. That's really my first love. I am thoroughly convinced of the power of narrative and the power of story. I like memoirs as well. But I just would go back and read the books I haven't had a chance to read that it seems like everyone else has read, that have been, wonderfully reviewed, that I've just, not gotten, if I don't teach it, I don't get to read it a lot of times, or if I'm not researching it. And so sometimes just to get into another world, and I don't even have a list yet, because then I would probably try to start reading it and not be working on what I'm supposed to be working on.
Well, I only thought of it because once I emailed you my dissertation, I realized that when I went to bed at night, everyone was asleep, and there wasn't something I had to be doing.
Yeah.
And I read comic books. That's what I did. I had comic books I'd been saving up because I knew if I started, then I would keep going. And so I saved up comic books and started reading them. It was fun.
Yeah. I mean, I actually, the first thing I do when I go on sabbatical is like start binge watching things on Netflix, like things like all the TV shows I've missed. I don't have a TV, so as actually, I get on Hulu and I probably binge watch for 2 weeks, and then I get books. Yeah, empty the brain out, clear my head.
So, have you thought about what the next writing project is?
Yes, actually, I've got a couple on tap. I'm finishing a book I've got 2/3 to 3/4 done, hopefully this summer. I've been writing about religious pluralism, and one of our process segments is going to be on religious pluralism, taught by Andrew Schwartz. So I've been writing about multiple religious belonging and trans-religious spirituality. I've been speaking and writing about that for a couple of years, so it's kind of finished that book up. Kind of just am really fascinated by people who don't fit into our categories, right? I love the way so many people in emerging churches will say, hey, we don't fit into categories. Let's create new ones. So I'm always really curious about how do we think about what people are doing who don't fit neatly into categories. And so that's what that book is about. My publisher wants me to write a lifestyle book because my Instagram is filled with vegan food that toddlers eat. And about spiritual practices. So the book people want me to write about, how I actually pull off my life, which I don't think is very interesting, but does involve a lot of vegan food and everyday spiritual practices and managing, hectic parenting and health scheures. So maybe that's interesting to people. I don't know.
Well, a couple of the questions that did come in that people had sent in were around how do process people pray? And I was like, regularly? No, but
no.
So maybe, and some of it was about parenting. So like I had an email that said, what's your advice as someone in the middle of kind of deconstructing their faith and trying to figure out what to do when you want to pass on the faith, but you don't want to hand on a version that terrorizes them later. But you don't want to go like, hands off. When I work it out, eventually we'll start going to a religious community, maybe, or whatever. Maybe say a bit about kind of what's your theology of parenting? And
man, that's good. Well, I'll do the prayer one first. How do I pray? In a couple ways, I'd still say, the Lord's Prayer in King James English. Because that's how I was taught it, and that's usually how I begin prayers. That still feels comfortable to me. And even though I insist all my students use inclusive language, I've never had a problem calling God Father. But I don't think of God as a father. It's just fine for me in that prayer. And then I usually just talk to God, like, God, did you see that? That was crazy, or what are we going to do about this? Or you got any ideas? They're usually like really very conversational. My prayers are, I'm not, and not that I get a booming voice back, that'd be cool, but I don't. So it's usually just me talking to God. And that's how I pray. In terms of parenting, my kid is not a PK, let me tell you. Technically, yes, but she doesn't sit still in church. She runs around church, runs, climbs, right? Can tell you very little about Christian traditions. And I know other kids her age who can, because she's just not a church kid. But she is a really spiritual kid. And so we decided very early on that since she was pre-verbal and couldn't pray, that we were going to sing our prayers to her. And so we picked songs that had theology in it that we like, and we sing those. And that's what I do with my daughter every morning. We wake up and I say, which song should we sing? And I'll list 104. And she'll say, yeah, that one. And she knows them. She won't sing them with me, but if I sing it wrong just to mess her up, she's like, no, that's not right, mommy. And that's where she gets her theology. I sing her spirituals. I sing her Sweet Honey in the Rock songs. I sing her hymns, if I like the hymns, right? And so that's how she gets a lot of her theology. She has God books, which are books that her godparents have wonderfully sent for her with Bible stories. And so she'll say, read me the story about how teacher Jesus loves the children. Because she knows what a teacher is. So I call Jesus Teacher Jesus. She doesn't know what a savior is, but she knows what a teacher is because she's got teachers at school, right? And so that's mainly how I do. And then I take her where I go. So she probably doesn't know what religion we are, because if we're with my Muslim friends and it's Eid and they're praying on their heads, she puts her head down. Sure, why not? And if it's Easter and she's like, Jesus is about hope, I'm like, yeah. Then she wants eggs. And I keep telling her, it's not about eggs. You don't eat eggs. And eggs are not about Jesus. She still wants to find some darn eggs, man. The culture.
If they were made out of broccoli, it would not go that way. The sugar really does it in.
No, there's nothing in the egg. She just wants to go look for eggs.
To go find them.
It's a hide and seek part, yeah, for her. But we'll go to church. She goes wherever I go. Sometimes it's my own tradition. Sometimes it's not my tradition. But I don't let her go to children's church. So that's probably the difference, because I'm not sure that they're going to teach her things that I agree with, or that I'll have to unteach them. If I send her into children's, like a religious school, it'd be like, my mama said, oh, well, we'd have problems. And so in that sense, I kind of choose what I want to share with her about our faith. And I try to share with her in a language that she's going to understand.
Mm-hmm. So what's the conversation or question you're most looking forward to getting to talk to her about? Like, my oldest, Elgin, just now started to ask really cool questions. And you're sitting there as the overeducated parent going, so do you want me to give you 4 options right now? Or are you just wanting to know what I think? And, but what's the conversation about your religious tradition that you're most excited to getting to share someday?
I dread the questions, actually. I'm like, oh, I have to explain these things. I do. I'm still kind of in shock that she's not a little kid anymore. So I'm still trying to give up the fact that she's not like 1.5 and that she is like 4.5. So I'm still kind of behind the times on that. And she really doesn't ask a lot of questions. She tells me what she thinks. Mommy, that's not going to work. Yes, it is. No, it's not. It's going to work. That's how our conversations go. But she does ask some questions. Most of her questions are about the world, right? She's, where do rainbows come from? Right. Things that, I end up Googling or trying to remember my science education about. So that's where a lot of her questions come from. I think, what would I want her to ask? I mean, there's a part of me that mourns that I don't give her the faith that I got. And I think that's very real as a progressive Christian. The faith that shaped me, which I love, is part of my history and part of my faith shaping and formation, is not a faith I'm involved in anymore, or one that has some beliefs I don't want to give her, but I want to give her the culture of it. I want to give her the sound of it. I want to give her the feel of it. And so I try to do that in what I sing to her and what I tell her about our family, but she doesn't get to experience it firsthand the way I did. And there is a grief to that. There's definitely a grief to that for me. But the question I think I look forward to her asking the most is maybe like, why do we go here? Wherever that here is. Why are we going to Eid? Why are we going to Elay? Why are we going to church? Why do we go here? And getting to share with her what I think is important about worship and community and being around other people and supporting their faith traditions and being involved in our faith tradition. So maybe that's probably the question I would like to answer the most.
Well, I think a lifestyle and parenting book would be fun, because I know the number of people who kind of left a large chunk of the death dealing side of their faith they were handed, but want to have and cherish and pass on the life giving and liberating side. Like, that's a predicament I think tons of people are in. And, figuring it out yourself is a difficult task enough, but then going, now how do I find a community and rhythm and practices to share the beautiful parts with my family and friends is extremely, extremely stressful for lots of people. I think plenty of people feel like they're nomads in a sense, and hover on the edge of lots of different communities because they haven't found a place they think they can dig roots in.
Yeah, one thing we do that's really fun, and I didn't realize how fun it was until recently, is how a lot of people, you could find them online, have these house rules, right? Like say please and thank you, and they're carved up, they look really pretty, and you hang them on the wall. And so I was like, that's a good idea, I should do that. But I didn't like any of them. So I wrote my own and had my friend who's a graphic artist blow it up really big for me and design it out. And they're not our house rules, they're our values. And every night we have family dinner around the same time. We sing our grace and I read the values. And my daughter sits in my lap and I read them to her and we all read them together. And I realized she's memorized them because she can read, but she can't read all those words. And she said them right along with me. And I was like, wow, these are going to be the foundation of her life. So when I was like, wow, score 1, I totally didn't plan that out. I just wanted to say, this is what we value. And there are cultural values and there are theological values about, one of them, the first one is in our house, we talk with God. That's one of our foundational values. And we honor our ancestors and we support our friends. And I'm like, yeah, those are things we believe. And so that's been a really fun way, I would say, of parenting that I didn't get per se. And I didn't, maybe other people are learning 10 Commandments somewhere or something. But she learns this is what we value and this is what we do. And that's, in everything I believe is actually there. And it's rooted by process belief, things I believe are freeing and supporting. And that will give her a solid way of moving in the world.
No, I think the book cover is right there. It says house rules, and you scratch out rules and put values under it.
Ooh, yeah, thank you. And totally.
I think I would want to read it.
Oh, I like that.
Because rules, values. And
yeah, I think that's it. Thank you. Next book.
Once you spend a couple of years preaching all the time, you're always ready to hear a story and an image that you could just put on a Post-it, pick it up later, and tell it. But yeah, I think that's helpful. I invented rules, we call them Fuller rules. When I only had Elgin, because we had him by ourselves for 6 years, I called them the Fuller Boy rules, and whenever we had father-son time every 6-9 months, we would go out, do something fun together, and then I would tell him the next rule. And I have to keep making them up every 6 to 9 months.
Right.
But he learns them and does them, and then he's like, well, I guess we have to just call them Fuller rules now that, Cora's here. I was like, yeah. And so now he's sitting around going was she old enough to know the next rule yet? But they're all, I think values sounds way cooler, so I have to switch it.